And welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Islam is one of the most significant forces shaping the world today, yet many Christians are so uncertain about the key beliefs and practices. In his widely anticipated book, 40 Questions About Islam, Missions Professor Matthew Aaron Bennett answers the most asked questions about Islam, helping readers to gain a clear understanding. In the latest release in the popular 40 Questions series, he uses his own research and time in the Middle East and North Africa to help readers more clearly understand what this religion is all about. Many of us in the West have questions about Islam and are curious about what our Muslim friends and neighbors believe. Our next guest says, "My hope is that the answers I give from my study of Islam and experience ministering among Muslim people can help you develop deeper, more meaningful discussions about the gospel with your neighbors. By charting a middle way between caricaturing Muslims as enemies and downplaying significant differences, this book aims to equip you to understand your Muslim neighbor, to ask informed questions that get at the heart of our differences, and to become more equipped to explain the Christian gospel to your Muslim friends." Matthew Aaron Bennett holds a PhD in missiology from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and is assistant professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University. He previously lived for 7 years in North Africa and the Middle East, where he developed a passion for helping Christians understand their Muslim neighbors. He's also the author of Narratives in Conflict, Atonement in Hebrews, and the Quran. Joining us now to talk about his new book, 40 Questions About Islam, is Dr. Matthew Bennett. Matthew, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Matthew, let's take a journey back in time to your upbringing that led you to faith, and then what attracted you to this particular area of focus, going into primarily Muslim areas, and getting a feel for not a compromising of the gospel, and I want to make sure that that's very, very clear, but in how to understand some of the fundamentals. And being Jewish and having people try to minister to me before I became a believer, they didn't speak the same language as me. They didn't have reference points that I had. And therefore, when they told me that Jesus saves, I would say, well, if he was really a good Jewish boy, he'd invest. That would be my response, because it was terminology that just didn't fit my narrative, and my Hebrew mind. So I know the same divide in communications exists within our Muslim neighbors and ourselves in who we position God to be and what our sacred texts say, and how we can frame it in a language that is going to convey that message. But going back to your calling, take us back to the early years, your kind of little journey to faith, and then what led you down this path.
Absolutely, yeah. That was a cluster of really enticing things to jump on. But I will just share a little bit of where I come from and how I got involved in ministry in this part of the world and to these particular people. Honestly, it goes back to being raised in a good Christian family where both of my parents loved the Lord and had genuine relationships with him. They modeled that for me and my sisters. And at an early age, I sensed the Lord drawing my heart to him and showing me the truth of what I had heard Sunday in and Sunday out. And at an early age, I became a believer, professed faith in Jesus as my Savior, and saw the work of the Spirit doing the work of sanctification in me, even in my early school years. But during those same years, it was funny how the Lord prepared me for this long-term journey. As I would sit in Sunday sermons, oftentimes we would have visiting missionaries come through, and there was this one woman who would come through every couple of years, and her ministry was specifically focused on working in the Middle East and North Africa and she would tell the wildest stories about smuggling Bibles into places like the Gaza Strip, and being deeply embedded in sort of this op center type approach to ministry. And I would leave those Sundays saying, Lord, it is amazing that you are doing this work through this woman and through the network of churches that she's connected to. I'm so excited that you are seeing your message advance in these hard places, but don't ever make me do that. And that was kind of my attitude for a long time. But really, in college, the Lord grabbed a hold of my heart and began taking the gospel that I believed and was committed to and saying, if this is truly the valuable thing that you're saying it is, and if it has the key to understanding not only your purpose, but also how the whole world is intended to come to serve Christ and his kingdom, then how can you withhold from the Lord your willingness to go? And it was during college that the Lord really began to open my hands to saying, Lord, wherever you would send me and whatever you'd have me to do, I want to be available to that. During the process of figuring out what that looks like, the Lord really did lay on my heart and my wife's heart the Muslim people as a place where there's a huge swath of peoples that have largely resisted the gospel message that would seem like they would be the ones most ideally suited to receive it, because they are claiming to extend the message that's come through the Torah and the Psalms and the gospel. And so the burden on our hearts for the Muslim world really began to be cultivated in the process of the Lord sending us to the nations.
In your experience in the Muslim nations as being ministers of the gospel, not hiding behind a veil that you were just there doing something else, which there's a lot of clandestine work being done where we as a program are heavily watched in Pakistan, we're heavily watched in Egypt, in Jordan, Israel. Right now we're prime time in the Middle East by design. We believe in the Great Commission, not the Great Omission. The Great Omission is to preach the gospel to everybody but the Muslims and the Jews. And so being on the Jewish side of that equation, I was very sensitive to the fact that the outreach, the explanation, the terminology, the gospel message was not being presented in a way that could be framed where it could be received. And there were so many misconceptions, misperceptions, and stereotypes that it led to a complete divorcing of the average, even evangelical Christian, from even engaging with the Muslim that they encountered on a regular basis. It was the subject. It was just don't bring that up. One of those taboo subjects. When the Great Commission was to go to all four corners of the earth and to take the gospel to every person, and so it's a mandate. It's not a choice, and so
Correct.
To go out and to make disciples. As you began, and really starting in your first book, Narratives in Conflict, Atonement in Hebrews and the Quran, which are similar but different. The role of Islam and the birth of Islam in today's environment, as we look at modern, what I would consider to be modern history, we're talking about in the last, for Israel, it's modern history. But when we go back to the origins, could we state that the origins really began with Ishmael and the 12 kingdoms that were assigned to him by petition of his father Abraham in consideration of a blessing for his other son, even though God did not acknowledge Ishmael in the way that he acknowledged Isaac when he proclaimed, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac."
Yes.
Would that be the origin, in your mind, as really the starting point for understanding how this came to be?
It certainly is going to be the origin that our Muslim friends are going to lay claim to. In fact, as you mentioned, the promise of the covenant given to Abraham's one and only son, certainly Genesis 22 clarifies that as Abraham brought his son, bound him, and placed him on the altar, that son was Isaac, the son of the promise. Whereas within the Quran, if you look at Quran Surah 37, it gives a brief account of Abraham and his son. The Quran itself actually doesn't specify which son is being bound, but according to Islamic history and tradition, their understanding of this account shows that it's actually Ishmael who is the son who's nearly sacrificed but preserved. And in fact, in the Quran's rendering of it, it praises not only Abraham, but also his son as being good Muslims, those who have submitted themselves to Allah. And so it's at that point that the Quran introduces a new lineage that most Islamic tradition is going to tie itself into, saying that this was Abraham himself was an exemplary Muslim before there were Jews and before there were Christians. And so by tapping into this story and taking on a different branch genealogically, there's a sense in which Islam purports to both be prefigured in Abraham before Judaism and Christianity arise, and then also in reappropriating that sacrifice and celebrating it today, they lay claim to kind of extending even beyond Jewish and Christian onset. And so it's a very important component in Islamic theology that they do tie themselves into Abraham's line, but take a different genealogical trajectory.
So, in looking at that and understanding that, I can, and you can see why many people say, listen, this enmity between Islam and the Jews and Israel, that's a family squabble over two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, and it's a family problem. We don't need to get involved in that family issue. They need to work it out themselves. And in many cases, it's a hijacking, if you will, of what the scriptures say. And the scriptures are you and I come from I'm an ordained Baptist minister. We come from the belief that Jesus was all man and all God, and that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of the Bible, not the God of Abraham, Ishmael, and that lineage. And so fundamentally, are Allah and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the same?
Yeah, that's a chapter in the book because it's a live question today. It's one of those things that's been debated within Muslim-Christian relations for the last 1,400 years. And honestly, the question as posed, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God, is part of the problem, I think, because we look at that question and it presents itself as a yes or no, which needs more nuance in order to get at the heartbeat of what's truly important in our discussion. What are we really after when we're asking that question? So some people look at the word Allah and they say, well, Christians were using the word Allah in Arabic to refer to God, or it could be derived from Syriac, long before Muhammad was around. And so it's already a Christian word loaded with description of the one true God. Or they might look at it and say the word itself isn't a proper name, but it is the definite article connected to the word for God. So it could be rendered the God instead of a proper name, as we would see God giving his proper name to Moses in Exodus 3:14. That's not how Allah functions within Arabic. So some would say, well, we're using the same word and so we worship the same God. But really, as you begin to unpack the layers of identifying that God and saying, what are the characteristics and attributes that this God has, then we begin to see some real divergence between the Islamic concept of God and the biblical God. We see similar attributes, but ultimately a God who remains aloof and a God who is forever transcendent and would never deign to come down and participate in the world that he has created. He would never take on flesh and bear the penalty by sending his son to die in our place. And he certainly would not send the Spirit to lead us into all truth. And the anticipation of the end, where we would be in the presence of God, which is the great reward that John saw held out in Revelation 21, that concept is foreign to Islam, because the role of this God is merely to be the judge and master. And as a result of that, he is not Father. He is not a God who would invite relationship, and he is not God with us in the same way as in the Bible. And I think those questions are important to distinguish between the idea of God, who is the one true creator. Well, do we agree with Muslims that there is one God who created all things? I think we can say yes, but when we ask who is that God, we give a different answer. And I think even more pressing is the question that we need to ask is not, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God, which is an anthropocentric question, but rather, does the one true God of the universe receive the worship of Muslims and Christians? And I think we have a very clear answer in that question, saying none of our worship is worthy apart from the atoning work of Christ and the cleansing blood that he offers that allows us to turn back pleasing worship. I mean, Paul says all of his good deeds were but filthy rags apart from Christ. So our Muslim friends who are denying Christ's atonement, their worship, no matter who they intend to be offering it to, is not a pleasing sacrifice. And that should not only clarify the question for us, but it should lay the burden of a compassionate evangelism and pleading with them to consider the gospel that allows for their worship to be received.
In my exploration of the Quran, the Hadith, the various surahs, I found it almost in or lacking original thought, that it was always presented in a comparative or relative way. For example, Muhammad was God's only prophet that would deny a Messiah, or Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater. Not the media portrays that as Allah is great, but is it not a correct translation that Allah is greater?
That would be the formal translation, yes. The idea is that he is greater than all created things. So he stands in a category unto himself. So whatever you were to put as the comparative, Allah is greater. So you could say Allah is the greatest, but I actually think the comparative nature of it serves to distinguish him from all other things in a way that greatest as a superlative might not quite get at. So that's the concept behind it.
So could we put the ... Allah is greater ... than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
I mean, certainly our Muslim friends would contend that Allah is greater than the Christian perversion of the understanding of a God who would be three persons and one God. They would say that the Jewish conception of who God is, who would covenant with his people, has been distorted by their repeated failure to observe his laws. And so Islam is the final dispensation of heavenly revelation that is secured by God's will and cannot be corrupted, and therefore it is the right articulation. So they would say, and the Quran leads them to say, that they do worship the same God as Moses, Abraham, Jesus, and David, and all the prophets that they would recognize, but they would say that they rightly conceive of the God that these prior prophets proclaimed, but which subsequent communities of Jews and Christians distorted. So Muhammad is not the only prophet within Islam. In fact, he's one of, according to some accounts, like 124,000 prophets. But that sense of him being the seal of the prophets allows him to be the one to lay claim to saying, I have delivered once and for all the same message that's been on the lips of prophets from Adam, through Abraham, through Moses, through Jesus, and now is finally ratified in this once and for all message delivered to the Arab people in a clear Arabic. And so it actually distinguishes Muhammad as the last of the prophets, but it also tries to tie him in with his message to all the other ones, which subverts Jesus's claim to divinity. It says, sure, he's a prophet, but he was just a prophet like Adam was. The Quran explicitly connects Jesus's likeness to Adam's likeness, and he's just a prophet like the one he prophesies is coming. Ahmed is coming is on Jesus's lips in the Quran, and Ahmed is a derivative of Muhammad's name.
So when we look at the statement that says God is love, and we take the biblical Judeo-Christian view of a loving God versus a God who, based on my understanding, that in order for me to have audience before Allah, I must be a shaheed, a martyr, and that grants me access to Allah and to the promises of the benefits of being a martyr, and I'm granted the opportunity to petition on behalf of my family for a secure place for them in paradise. Yet the answer cannot be given or passed down. The family must live in wonder and therefore move along the path of only assurance of their place in heaven or paradise would be to become a shaheed, a martyr themselves. That's the only guarantee in Islam for quote-unquote salvation. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, Muhammad himself instructed his followers to pray for him because he couldn't claim to be certain that he would receive Allah's mercy. Now, the discussion about shaheeds or martyrs receiving a certain future is really derived more from the hadith and the traditions than it is from the Quran, and that holds true for most contemporary Islamic theology, in that the Quran is very opaque. It's hard to really understand what it means. It's written in 7th century Arabic. It's written in a poetic sort of fashion. And honestly, for the vast majority of Muslims, while they can read and recite and remember it, their call to interpret it or unpack it is really something that the vast majority of Muslims are not involved in. They have to appeal to their sheikhs and their religious authorities in order to make sense of what it means. And so most Muslims are far more familiar with what's come to be known as the Sunnah, or the collection of hadith that talk about things that Muhammad said at moments that he was receiving the Quran, or elements from his biography that give an illustration as to what circumstances sort of precipitated the revelation of various parts of the Quran. And so those things end up having much more interpretive value for your everyday Muslim and shape their lives more so. So within the hadith, and particularly streams of the hadith that might have more of a Sufi flavor, there is going to be conversation about getting to enter God's presence or be with God. But in the Quran, the closest thing to being in God's presence is in a late surah, which mentions that the most righteous among you may glimpse God in paradise. So the great testimony and vision that John has of a heavenly Jerusalem descending to a new heaven, or from a new heaven onto a new earth, where God says the dwelling place of God is with man, that is not part of the expectation for Muslims, because all their focus eschatologically is looking at paradise as a place of blessing, a place of refreshment, and a place of pleasure, rather than being in the hellfire, that is the condition in which the mukafirin, the deniers, the infidels, will be cast into. And so it's a reward-based vision of eternity that isn't characterized by the immediate presence of God, which is a major difference in really everything related to the Islamic worldview.
The understanding of the attributes of God and the differences between the message of Islam and the message of Judaism and Christianity, one of love, one of a position where through repentance, through sacrifice, whether or not it's the sacrifice of your own self in accepting Jesus, or within Judaism, the old sacrificial system. Within Islam, it's rather punitive, and forgiveness, repentance, reconciliation is not really the watchword. The watchword is submission, or what we would call legalism, complete adherence to the standards that are not universally applied to men and women. And many of the practices within Islam are quite confusing. Number of wives, the fact that Muhammad had a wife that was pledged to him at 6 years old and married to him at 9 years old. These are things that are anathema to the Judeo-Christian mind. We can't conceive of a 9-year-old child being given in marriage and being expected to give birth to children. That would fall in the category of statutory rape within the construct of Western civilization. So there are some things that have not been, when we look at what we might consider in a modernized context, or even in a conservative view or lifestyle of Islam. Many of these practices exist today in the Islamically controlled nations, of which I believe there's approximately, my numbers could be wrong, what God promised as 12 has now become about 50 or 52, where there's a Muslim population of 80% or higher, and they're almost contiguous as they began to expand through immigration and migration, in which some have said was a form of social jihad, was the expansion, the having many children. The reason why Islam is growing 5 to 6 times faster than Christianity is by sheer propagation of children. There's more being born to the families than there are to the Christian families. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, and it's something that's been overtly stated by Islamic populations. I believe it was 2010. There was a Congress of Muslim thinkers in Chicago, and one of their stated aims was to encourage the immigration of Muslim peoples into Western countries so as to be able to have babies and increase the influence of Islam within those societies. So that, I think, that language of a form of jihad, which functionally means struggle in the name of Allah, is an appropriate use of that term to look at raising populations. Now, you began by mentioning the discussion of the God of Islam as being loving versus being a master. And I think that is one key distinction, that for Christians, what we see is we see a God whose attributes, even those that we seem to posit at different ends of a spectrum, can all be held at one and the same time and are demonstrated. For instance, his wrath being satisfied in his mercy when he's on the cross in his Son. We get that parallel of his attributes and how they can function all at the same time, beautifully manifest for us in the cross. And so we can say wholeheartedly that God is wrathful against sin, rightly, but he's also merciful and gracious to sinners, and there's no compromise, no conflict there. For Muslims, the idea of God being a loving God who would pour himself out for his creation is simply not part of their concept. There are typically 99 names that are traditionally associated with God. There's different lists of how those names work out, but the names themselves function like attributes or character traits. One of them could be rendered kind of a compassionate, loving, but it's certainly not at the center of the relationship between God and his creatures, his image bearers. Within Islam, you've got the idea of any relationship between God and man solely being characterized as a slave to master. God is the righteous judge who will rule according to his own justice, but that justice is truly inscrutable. And that's where sometimes when we talk about Islam as a works-based salvation, that is accurate as to how most Muslims look at their situation. They're trying to add up good works or hasanat in their account so that on the day of judgment the scales will tip in their favor. But at the same time, their ultimate hope, if they are true to Islamic theology, is that God will simply choose to be merciful. So there is a sense in which God is a God of mercy within Islam in a way that we don't typically characterize it as, but it's a mercy that is not commensurate with him being just against wrath in terms of anything that would be knowable to us in a Christian context. So that relationship is not a father to his children. It is a relationship of master to slave or servant.
We're talking with Dr. Matthew Bennett, author of the new book, 40 Questions About Islam, containing really 40 of the most common, I believe, questions of understanding the differences so that we can frame the gospel narrative in a language and reference point of understanding, laying a foundation of understanding so that you can talk the language of understanding what your Muslim neighbor believes. And as you look across the world, we see that there is persecution of Christians in many Muslim nations. We hear about Sharia. We hear about the Shiite agenda for creating the caliphate or world domination under the heavy hand of Islam, and that anyone who is not an adherent to the Quran and to the tenets of Islam, which I believe really is an ideology and not a religion, because it has laws and it has a system of punishment in violation of those laws, and has civil aspects to it as well as what we would consider to be spiritual aspects to it. It really kind of straddles the fence on religion and ideology, which needs to be framed properly. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Shiites and Sunnis, and is this something that in America we need to concern ourselves with? We need to understand what's going on in the world. The COVID virus has become the headline. The violence in the streets for BLM and Antifa has become the headline. And what's been going on in the Islamic world, in the Middle East and Africa, and in Asia has been pushed back in the news to where it's really not being talked about. But make no mistake, there is much going on in the Middle East right now that is shaking the very core of the Islamic nations, and that is peace with Israel. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Dr. Matthew Bennett. 40 questions about Islam. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and my special featured guest twice per month with Rabbi Zeb Parat and Carl Gallups, and monthly with Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Lake, Dr. Timothy Jennings, Dr. Mark Baker, Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, Drs. Michelle and Mark Sherwood, Dr. Kim Moss, Derek Gilbert, Peter Rosenberger, Brandon Gallups, Steve Fair, Stephen Black, and Sean Tabbitt for in-depth insights into Israel, prophecy, the unseen realm, the brain, spiritual warfare, overcoming shame, mysteries of the Bible, prophetic insights, the sensational and the supernatural, caregiving, addiction recovery, understanding the divided heart, same-sex attraction, and much more. We're proud to feature some of the greatest biblical minds from both Israel and around the United States. Check out our featured guest lineup and 24/7 feed on ignitinganation.com or watch by topic on any device with our free apps. If you can't find what you need, you're just not looking in the right place. Follow us on social media and download our free apps today.
With today's smartphone technology, news, information, sports, and entertainment is widely available and almost unbounded. But what about the information that believers in Yeshua are looking for? Well, now there's an app for that. Igniting a Nation now has apps available for Android and iPhone. With our app, you'll gain access to everything you would in our website, from our featured guests to our live streaming shows. Visit Google Play or the Apple Store and download Igniting a Nation's new app today.
Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and Israel's #1 rated guide, Edo Canaan, for our annual Israel trip. Our 2022 trip is now open for registration for our 18th trip to Israel. Our trip will take us from Tel Aviv to the Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and 4 nights in Jerusalem. You will walk where Yeshua walked and watch the Bible turn from black and white to living color. Visit ignitinganation.com/events and download the registration form today. No, it's not too early to take advantage of our payment plan designed to fit any budget. All of our trips sell out, and we want you to experience this life-changing journey. Registration is now open for April 2nd to 13th, 2022, and we promise you, you will never read your Bible the same way again. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Dr. Matthew Bennett, author of the new book, 40 Questions About Islam. Matthew, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Joy to be here.
And we appreciate your perspective and the detail of your answers, because we don't have a lot of sources to go to. The media has been our only source of information, and unless you have strong, verifiable Middle East sources, the information you're getting is not accurate. If you're watching Al Jazeera, what the words that are coming out of their mouth, if you speak Arabic, are not the words are on the screen, and it's being translated for your benefit, not for the accuracy of what's being stated. So it's very important, and that kind of brings us to a concept of taqiyya within Islam that permits me to say whatever I need to say in order to advance the cause of Islam. Is that fundamentally a universal philosophy, or is that to the more adherent, and is that supported in the Hadith? It's stated clearly in the Quran, but in the let's call the Hadith the life application Quran.
Yeah.
How is that framed?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair estimation of what permission is given to Muslims as they are interacting with non-Muslims in order to give an answer or to give a presentation of what Islam truly is. So certainly there is, I would argue that there's something knit into the fabric of our being that says the violence that is perpetrated by some sects of Islam is not, it doesn't jive with how we know instinctively we are to relate to the people around us. And so between that and this idea of wanting to present Islam in a favorable light to those outside of it in order to encourage them to consider it, there is that permission to say there's certain things you can hide or obscure, certain things you could even, what we would say, lie about these aspects of Islam in order to defend its image to the non-Muslim.
And by contrast, in Christianity, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, so whether or not you a Jewish believer like myself or an engrafted Christian with the same Ten Commandments hanging in your church that Moses carried on the stone tablets down from Mount Sinai hasn't changed, whether or not you're a believer in Jesus or not. Thou shalt not lie or bear false witness is clearly a foundational tenet. So a difference in what we would consider to be deception, evangelistic deception, which is you being in the mission field, of hearing somebody using deception to win a soul would be called into accountability and yanked out of the mission field immediately, and be held accountable for such a grievous offense.
Yeah, the ends don't justify the means. They don't subvert God's ethical prescription for us, and I think that's something that we need to be conscious of, particularly, as you mentioned, the Middle East, places where there is a discussion of creative access being needed or a platform. Being in the mix in those places should not be something that we're inclined to actively lie or deceive in order to establish residency. Let's be honest with the work that we're telling the government we're coming to do, and let's do it with excellence so that the testimony from our lips is also the testimony of our life.
What are some of the, and I'd like you to use, we've got about 10 minutes left to not break down every one of these chapters, but what are some of the common misconceptions and common, I don't want to say faux pas, but conversation, what are some good conversation starters? What are some things to avoid, which would be conversation ending?
Yeah, that's good. Honestly, I love the way that you framed even this discussion, saying you as a Jewish believer needed to have the language used to make sense of the gospel be something that accords with your worldview. And I think that's absolutely necessary for understanding our Muslim friends and how they're going to receive the conversation that we want to have with them, and not change the gospel in any way, but realize that there are places where we and our Muslim friends are going to use the same language, but we're not meaning the same things by that shared language. And that's tricky. When we talk about things like sin, or when we talk about salvation or forgiveness or cleansing, all of those things are things that our Muslim friends would nod along with, saying, yes, we need that. We have access to that through the Quran and through following the straight path. And those concepts are going to be born on the same words that we want to use. Well, our tendency in the West especially to look for things like common ground is going to lead us to sometimes make a superficial assessment that says, oh, we do believe the same things because we're using the same word for sin. But it's far more important for us to, when we encounter some of those things, to say, well, we're both talking about sin, but what what do you understand sin to mean? How does that function? Does that rupture a relationship with God, or is that sort of a natural output of being inherently a weak-willed and weak memory sort of being? And you're going to see the distinction between how these words function within the broader theological system of Islam, and it's going to provide fruitful interaction, even though it might feel like you're eroding some of the common ground that you might be inclined to stand on. The reality is, if we're truly loving our Muslim neighbors, superficial misunderstanding of one another isn't loving them. So let's be willing to engage at some of those points that might sound like confrontation, but do so from the posture of saying, I want to actually hear what you're saying so that you can hear what I'm saying. And that might mean unpacking some of these common ideas a little bit more extensively. I would suggest looking at there's a whole section on investigating the Quranic or the Islamic worldview, looking at what is creation in Islam, what is the fall, what is the plan of restoration, and then what is the eschatological hope for Muslims. And though the storyline may have some of the same basic features, we see that it actually heads off in a very different direction. And being able to be familiar with that story is then going to give us insight into where we need to ask further questions in order to then better communicate what the biblical story and gospel is. One very basic way to answer your question about what are some ways to get into conversations with Muslims, I would just ask them, when did you become a Muslim? And that question may seem very basic, but in and of itself, it's going to present a different expectation for most of your Muslim friends, because they're believing that they were just born into this faith and that one receives their faith from their parents. And so the idea of making an active choice to become a Muslim is something that's oftentimes jarring and foreign to them. But then for you to respond by saying, well, I became a Christian at such and such a point in my life, causes a whole nother set of questions for them, saying, well, what were you before that? And depending on your relationship, you can say, I was under God's wrath. I was an alien. I was outside of the family of God, and yet in Christ, He's rescued me. And those points of conversation will open up into really fruitful dialogue, where you get to not only show the distinction between the faiths, but to present your great hope and to hold that out for somebody who, while they're sucking breath, whether they're Muslim, atheist, Jewish, or anything else, they're still within the saving grace of saving reach of God's mercy.
Yeah, I think a common error is that since it's clearly the Islamic people groups clearly mentioned in Psalm 93 that will form a coalition against Israel, and then reinforced with another completely distinct Islamic coalition formed in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog-Magog alliance, and they're not the same. They're one is not a member of the other group, which is very interesting. As we look at this, some would say, well, this is an enemy, and I would say that anyone is an enemy of the gospel who is actively. We have enemies of the gospel in Israel. We have enemies of the gospel here in Birmingham, Alabama. You have enemies of the gospel, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to witness them. It doesn't mean I'm going to withhold from them, because ultimately I may be on the opposite side. I'm already on the opposite side, so I'm not changing my position. I'm already there. My goal is to win their soul, not for me, but for them. The greatest gift I can give them is to share the gift of salvation. That's loving my neighbor as myself. And I think we've lost some sight. We've allowed this crazy since the fall of the Shah in Iran, which was really the trigger point for modern history, as we look at when did our eyes shift, because OPEC, they were just the oil-producing nations. We didn't frame them as the Muslim nations. They were the oil producers. It wasn't until the fall of the Shah, the rise of the Ayatollah, that we began to see an agenda being formed. And then we began to see the Islamization of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and now a move towards the Islamization of America. But we're much slower, even though there's quite an investment being made in building mosques in cities that have no Muslim population right now. We have one here in Montgomery, Alabama. That's a $5 million mosque, and there's no Muslims in Montgomery. But they're obviously preparing for this wave of Muslims. So in wrapping this up, you cover in the book, for the purpose of equipping the saints to be able to share the gospel in a framework that can be received by the Muslim, regardless of where they are on the spectrum, from secular Muslim to radicalized Muslim. The narrative is the same if you understand the same basic. It's like the difference between a secular Jew and an ultra-Orthodox Jew. The linguistics are the same. And so if you're equipped to speak the language of it, you stand a better chance of entering into a dialogue where you can get the gospel message delivered. And is that a summation of your intent in putting together this 40 questions about Islam so that people didn't have to feel so ill-equipped and so awkward in this discussion?
Yeah. And one of the points that I try to make early on is that you can study Islam exhaustively, and you can know all of the theology, you can memorize the Quran and be a master of the Hadith and have all of this information, and still the person in front of you is not the embodiment or incarnation of Islam as a concept. That is a living, breathing person whose framework has been shaped by the Islamic story. And so knowing that can be a helpful aid to encountering them. But honestly, they are a person who is bearing the image of God, who was designed to turn pleasing worship to him. And so how do we speak to them in a way that recognizes the points of divergence between our worldviews, but also recognizes that this person is not an ideology in flesh, but they're rather believers. Likewise, speaking to those who would be of maybe a liberal persuasion from the Christian perspective, who would say, oh, there's really no fundamental difference. I want to call them back to say, no, there's major differences. Or for those Christians on the other extreme who would say these are enemies, as you described them, I want to call them back and say, no, these are image bearers. And just like Paul was an enemy of the church who was capable of being turned to a great minister of the church and the author of much of the New Testament, we too need to recognize that our God is not so short-armed so as to save them. And our desire is to share that gospel that is the great hope.
Amen. I thank you. I thank you for writing such a valuable tool, and I want to encourage everyone who has a heart for the salvation of the lost, all the lost. It is our great commission as instructed to us to understand and to not allow our ministry to be a stumbling block, and our lack of knowledge and linguistic understanding is a stumbling block in the narrative with the Jewish community and with the Muslim community. And I thank you for addressing this, because it's very important to me, because I could not be reached for 44 years. No one even attempted. They didn't speak my language. So very important. Thank you. We've been talking to Matthew Bennett. If you Want more information? Visit ignitingnation.com and click on today's program with Matthew Bennett, 40 Questions About Islam, and order a copy of the book. Dr. Matthew Bennett, thank you. You've been a blessing, and I appreciate you investing the time to give us such a practical tool in understanding something that is so present today. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you so much, brother. Take care.
You. All right. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.